Bonjour à tous. Hello everyone, good morning. Today we're going to cover why you need cyber risk quantification and what cyber risk quantification is about, as well as what the use cases can be. How do you make use of it within organization? Why CRQ? And I'll start with three main drivers. I'm sure some of you know of some of those drivers individually, but I want to emphasize the fact that those in factor are making CRQ a very compelling obligation to organization of all size today. The first one is digitalization, and I'll come back to it in a minute. The second driver is the fact that decision-making is currently supported by techniques, qualitative analysis, as well as intuition or expert intuition or expert judgment, and we'll see that there are some shortcomings to those approaches. And there's a third driver, which is the evolution of regulations. Let's start off with digitalization, a very common term that we all understand, but we fail to measure to what extent this has impacted the way we conduct business and how most of what we do within organization, as well as in our personal lives, is now dependent on IT. 65% of global GDP is now digitized, or will soon be. What that means is that, indeed, data is really the new natural resource. What is making our value chains, our value proposition within organization compelling and unique. But if that's the case, if we all agree that indeed that's one of the main natural resources, then by nature, this is making cyber risk one of the main risks that any company, any size, anywhere in the world is exposed to. The second trend is that we, human, have qualities in the way we conduct our judgment. We make our judgment. We make decisions. But we also have shortcomings to those qualities. Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize psychologist and economist, have demonstrated that the way we make judgment have some limitation, which are known as cognitive biases. Those are rules that we either inherited or we learned by which we make some decision. But the way we put those to work in a number of circumstances are creating systematic errors. Even experts are sometimes at fault in their decision making. We're also poor decision maker, unreliable decision makers by the fact that we are influenced by things that are not related to the decision we're trying to make. We're influenced by the mood in which we are today, the weather, or the time we had our last meal. And the response we provide to some questions will vary vastly, influenced by those factors. So one way of countering those cognitive biases is to actually use methods. And that's what organizations do when they conduct risk analysis to identify some of the risks they're exposed to. Only most of the time they use qualitative approaches, and there are also a number of scientific researches that have shown that nominal scales, using names a lot, a bit, rarely, are very reliable. Ordinal scales suffer the same default and prevent risk analysis to serving their goal, which is informing decision makers. Now there's a third trend that's in the making, and that's been in the making for a few years. If indeed the data economy is to flourish, the foundation of the digital economy needs to be trust amongst all stakeholders. And to that end, regulators are stepping in and requiring that organizations be able to articulate their risk, the cyber risk to which they're exposed, in a lot more defendable and objective manners. Some of the most advanced, and I'm thinking of an example here in Europe, the German Institute of CPAs, Certified Public Accountant and Financial Auditors, last year made a recommendation to publicly traded companies requiring that they articulate their risk with statistics and probabilities, estimating the range of frequency of occurrence of loss events, as well as the financial impact of those loss events. So those are three key trends that are really coming together and making CRQ soon to be an obligation for organizations of all sizes. Now let's hear Tom explain what CRQ is and how you put it to work.
Great. Thank you, Christophe. Thanks for that introduction. So my name is Tom Callahan. Christophe and I are co-founders of a company called C-Risk. We specialize in cyber risk quantification. We do training in cyber risk quantification. We provide consulting and managed services and what we call enablement services. Now, we've been doing quantification of technology and cyber risk for probably 7 years, 5 years in anger, so to speak. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we do it, what the use cases are, and kind of echo what Christophe said around some of the kind of secondary benefits you get from this approach. So we've spoken about CRQ, cyber risk quantification. What is cyber risk quantification? So in our industry, we have a lot of terminology, acronyms. Very often they're not well defined. There's no kind of single definition for CRQ. I have 3 definitions on the screen. One is from Gartner, which is focusing more on the business aspect of CRQ, thinking about digital assets and expressing risk exposure in business terms or financial terms. The second terminology is a little bit more focused for risk professionals from ISACA, and it makes reference to probability and impact, which is kind of linked to the traditional ISO view of seeing risk. But again, it talks about expressing risk in financial terms, which is very important. And the third definition is a little bit more about the methodology. And this is something that we use in our training courses, but it complements the others. So this is about using techniques, models, and frameworks to calculate an organization exposure in monetary terms, again, in financial terms. So these are 3 definitions of CRQ, cyber risk quantification. Let's talk a bit about what is it for. There's no point in academically measuring something if there isn't a use for that measure. So let's go to the next slide. So as I mentioned, at C-Risk, we've been doing CRQ for 5 years with a kind of a selection of industries on a global basis in Europe and the US. Typically what we see is we begin a cyber risk quantification program or project with the goal of better communicating risk exposure from a technical perspective, from technical digital assets to the executive team. Very often we're responding to a request from the board, maybe thinking about a company that's going through a transformation, and they're wondering what is the risk that I'm exposed to by increasing my digital footprint. So this is communication. Once you do that, it becomes a very useful tool for the CISO, the CRO, the CIO, in terms of justifying their investment, but also prioritizing where you put that investment. And interestingly, if you do a quantification exercise on a business, sometimes you can get some surprises. Sometimes things you thought maybe weren't that valuable are things you thought perhaps didn't expose you to risk actually do. So this is a very, very interesting and useful use case. The third thing is looking at regulatory compliance. Now, we have customers that use the output of CRQ studies to demonstrate to the regulator they're investing in the right things. No organization has got infinite budget, infinite resources. Regulators understand this. Therefore, being able to show that I'm investing money in mitigating the right risks with the right controls is a very, very powerful tool. And I guess, coming on from that, we can look at things like merger and acquisitions, pre-acquisition, post-acquisition, and also looking at optimizing the way in which we structure cyber insurance policies. So this is kind of what we've seen. Now, Gartner did a study last year, and they agree, which is great. From Gartner's perspective, in terms of polling, CROs, CISOs, communication is the top one. Okay. So we've explained what CRQ is. We've explained what is it for. Most people wonder, how can I possibly do this? It's going to be too hard. You know, traditional risk methodologies focus on, I guess, you know, estimations around likelihood and impact in terms of some of the scales and labels that Christophe mentioned. How do you translate that into measurable numbers? So the first and most important thing is standards, using transparent standards. So we use, there's only one, I guess, open standard in the industry around quantifying risk. That's called FAIR, Factor Analysis of Information Risk. FAIR provides a taxonomy and an ontology to decompose a risk scenario into variables and then to measure those variables. But what's really important is it's open. It's open so we can share information across organizations. We can share best practices. And kind of what we're seeing in the industry is that the platforms and GRC tools that are most successful in putting quantification in place adopt the FAIR standard. And you'll see today you can visit Egerie or Citalid, two French companies that have platforms that use FAIR. On a global basis, you have platforms like MetricStream and RiskLens, which also use the FAIR standard and methodology. So some other kind of important aspects that you need to introduce is the fact that you're dealing with uncertainty. So people think of quantification, they think of a precise number, a single value. Risk is uncertain, it's a range. So you need to be able to work in ranges. Rather than thinking about risk as a single number when you're quantifying it, it's actually a distribution. So the tools that you use need to be able to work with ranges, and your analysts need to be trained in some, you know, not incredibly difficult statistical tools to work in ranges also. And I guess the biggest objection we get from our customers is data. So how do I know what data to put into the variables in the model, and how do I estimate my ranges? Now, there's lots of data available. That's the first thing I would say. It's not a blocker. The trick is to use the right data. There's huge amounts of data in our industry. A lot of it is driven by marketing, which isn't always a bad thing, but sometimes it's targeted at a particular type of use case or scenario which may not be applicable to your organization. So my message is that there is data, lots of data from the insurance industry. There are more and more data analyst companies providing this data. So again, data is not a problem, and if you want to kind of dig into that topic some more, Christophe and I can kind of, you know, explain a bit more how we do that. Okay. So let's just kind of dig a little bit deeper into the how, and we could probably spend 2 hours on this, so this is really quick. But as I mentioned, FAIR has a taxonomy, an ontology, where you can decompose a risk scenario into the loss event frequency, which is the probability of an event, and the loss magnitude. Each variable in the model is expressed as a range. Some are a count, some are a percentage. And there are two parts to this model. There's a left-hand side, the probability of an occurrence, but there's the right-hand side, which is the impact. And what we find is that the left-hand side of the model can be derived using a mixture of industry standard data plus your internal controlled performance. The right-hand side of the model, which is the loss of an event for your organization, that's something which is very easy to do for your own organization if you communicate with the business. So we're kind of moving beyond this idea of having, you know, a cost per record breached and thinking about, for an organization, what's the impact of a data breach according to the type of data, probably the volume of the records, the geography, the regulation, the industry, etc. And we can get very precise numbers for the right-hand side of the model while estimating the left-hand side using industry standard data. We put that into a tool, a platform, which supports some sort of value at risk statistical analysis, value, you know, Monte Carlo, for example. And that produces a distribution. So it's not a single number. What we're saying is that there's X probability of Y loss, but you can pull out things like the average, or most likely loss, the average of the distribution, the mean of the distribution, if you want to work with single numbers. So it's a very flexible model, even though if you're not accustomed to using statistics, it can be a bit scary at the start, but it's actually relatively simple. Okay. So I'm going to just show a couple of examples of the output of a CRQ analysis. And I'm going to start with what I call the right-hand side of the model, the loss side. Again, in IT, we tend to think about things like kill chains, they MITRE attack, tactics, techniques, which is really important, and that helps to estimate the probability of an event happening. What's kind of forgotten sometimes is the impact. And we have this idea of a loss chain, which is like a kill chain, which shows you how business losses occur over time within a particular scenario. And if you model business loss over time, you can mitigate those losses a lot better. And you can communicate with, again, regulators, legal teams, and your business teams. So this is an example of, at a really high level, what we call loss flows for confidentiality scenarios, which are breaches, or for availability scenarios. So again, huge value in building out loss chains to complement your kill chains, which help you to build in resilience and figure out how to stop what could be a major event getting out of hand. And I mentioned, here we have, I'm not going to walk through all these, but I guess what we're seeing here is there's different ways of articulating and presenting the output of a quantitative risk assessment. Ultimately, you're getting a distribution of loss and a probability of each loss occurring. You can use the numbers in different ways according to the use case. So I mentioned at the start that there are different use cases, communicating to the board, optimizing cyber insurance. Depending on the use case, you can use different numbers from the model. So we'll typically use like the most likely loss if a scenario is to occur, the most likely probability, but we can annualize and average the loss to compare different types of scenarios to each other for prioritization of investment. So again, this opens up a huge amount of possibilities in terms of reporting on and communicating risk in ways which are defendable and understandable by the business. So this is my last slide, and I'm going to hand back to Christophe. But I mentioned the use cases, but as you start embarking on using CRQ in your organization, there are secondary benefits in addition to the use cases. A model like FAIR is more precise in terms of how it defines risk and allows you to decompose risk into factors, and that vastly improves the quality of your risk register and the way in which your team will see risk, no pun intended, and also the way in which different teams in your organization can communicate about risk scenarios. Very often we work with customers, we'll get a risk register and we'll go through it and we'll find out that a lot of the things in the register, although they're important, they're not actually risks. And this model helps you to kind of work through that kind of analysis. It also improves objectivity by the fact that we're using numbers and we can do mathematics on those numbers. It helps to reduce bias, which is one of the things Christophe spoke about in the introduction. And ultimately, it improves communication in the organization. Communication regarding a topic which is incredibly important because of digitalization, but often misunderstood. So I'm going to hand back to Christophe, who's going to wrap up. We can take questions afterwards. We can take the questions in English or French, whatever you guys want. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tom. Indeed, this will serve to conclude. I hope that what we had set as an agenda and a set of objectives, explaining what some of the drivers and some of the compelling reasons should entice all your organizations to start looking at risk in a quantitative way, as opposed to either just relying on intuition for some of the most important decisions to be made when it comes to securing the IT system of your respective organization or the information it contains. So, as Tom alluded to, CRQ vastly improves the governance, the way decisions are made. Gartner and a number of other research have shown that the investment in IT security doesn't equate to increased security of the organization. And we repeatedly, week after week, months after months, see companies in the world that are impacted, that are victim of cyber criminals or cyber loss events when they are non-intentional. And those companies were very mature and they were investing tons of money in their IT. That was not enough. So we need to improve the way IT security decisions are made, and CRQ is the way forward. There are many use cases. I think you've mentioned a few, Tom. Merger and acquisitions, communicating to the board, making sure that all stakeholders within the organization recognize that this is a business risk, not something that is left to technologists.
And actually, I'd like to mention, I forgot to mention something super important, right? I spoke about the use cases. I didn't speak about what are not the use cases, right? And very often people think the CRQ is a tool to be used in an operational real-time mode. And it's not, right? It's a governance tool. It's used to make decisions around investments, projects, and prioritization. It's not particularly useful in a SOC environment or a kind of a line one of defense. So just another super, and it's just kind of a misunderstanding people have when they come across this first. It very much complements those telemetry from an operational perspective, and that operational telemetry can be an input into CRQ. But CRQ, again, it's information security governance rather than operational.
Thank you, indeed. And I want to maybe conclude this conclusion slide with one key element. People fear that CRQ requires an incredible amount of expertise in cyber security or lots of maturity in the way they conduct their governance. We actually have discovered, we also had that cognitive bias. We thought this was the case, but over the last 5 years, we've come to realize that the less mature a company is, the less into IT security it is, the more they will gain very early on from a CRQ program. And CRQ program are things you can achieve and get going in a matter of weeks. We do a top 3 or a top 5 for a number of organizations of all size here in Europe or in the US in a matter of 4 or 5 weeks and for 25, 30, 35K euros or dollars. So it's something that is not predicated by the maturity. Again, quite the opposite. The earlier you are in your IT security journey, the more you'll gain from CRQ. With that, I'd like to open the mic for questions, comments.
And Christophe, perhaps before we go to the questions, maybe we can remind people about the summit.
Yes. Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes. So, as we said in the intro, Tom and I are active members of the FAIR Institute, which is a non-profit professional organization. We're happy to manage the Paris chapter, but we're also involved in Germany, Switzerland, and the UK. The UK, where our first European summit will take place June 1st, and we're evidently looking forward to many of you making it to London. Thank you.
We listen to your questions.
Et bien sûr en français, Jérôme.
Et en français aussi.
Donc il n'y a pas de souci.
On attend vos questions. Bonjour madame.
Hello, thank you very much to both. It was really interesting. I think what you were explaining is really key for the future. Because it will help people to understand how much is at stake. And so we need this data to convince our direction and commanding officers in every organization. So I have 2 questions. The first, maybe you will not answer, but I would be really interested to see an example of the use of your platform. Just, I don't know, some windows to see the result.
Yeah, sure.
And second question, but I think you would have presented already, so probably it will not happen. But the second question is about, because I work for the state, for France, and my question is about the value of the personal data of the citizens. For example, ransomware on the information system of a small town. Nothing is vital, but it's a problem for the image and also for the citizens who are whose data are leaking.
Okay.
So how much do you evaluate that? Thank you very much.
There's two questions. I'm going to answer the first one, and I'm going to let Christophe answer the second one, so he can think about the answer while I'm answering the first one. You mentioned our platform. So we actually don't have a platform. We have intellectual property on risk scenarios and data, but we support any platform on the market that adheres to the FAIR standard. So if you're in France, in public sector, there's a platform called Égérie, which you guys may or may not use, which supports FAIR. And we're partners with Égérie, and we can help people implement it. Yeah. So, and that's really important, right? Because I mentioned at the start that we passionately believe that for CRQ to function, it has to be open and transparent. Therefore, we only work with standards, open, transparent data, and transparent platforms. So the other question.
So the other question is a very interesting one, but quite difficult to reply in one sentence. There's an increased value to our digital life, our digital personas. So it's key, and the GDPR legislation has introduced, and there are many equivalent across the world, in the US, in California, but there are many states that are pushing forth those data privacy legislation. Now, usually the stance is the stance from the data subject. And like Neil in France insist on PIA to be performed to identify those processes which are putting the data subject at risk. The stance we take is on the side of the organization, whether public or private sector organization, and the way they manage and what risk they are exposed to in managing, collecting, and processing personal data. So there are really two sides to your question and two ways of addressing that, with two angles which are not opposite, but quite different. From the organization side, which is where we would intervene, and then from the data subject side, which is where the regulator and the data protection authorities across Europe and across the world are intervening. Yeah?
I'm sorry, I thought that you were working with the insurance companies, but you don't. Si, un peu.
So we're happy to work with insurance companies, but usually we will work on what risk they're exposed to themselves as insurers. When we do mention the cyber insurance use case as a great use case for CRQ, we're also usually on the side of the client, the organization that is seeking to optimize its cyber coverage, which is one of the remediation strategy when it comes to handling risk. It's the transfer of the risk that as an organization, I'm not able to cover or face myself. And we will help articulate for the client the way they should best optimize their cyber coverage. Okay?
Merci pour votre question. Another questions? Une autre question en français, hein, voilà, aussi possible.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I still didn't get a point, which is a key one for everyone who is trying to assess risks. How do you reach a quantitative evaluation without any data on likelihood?
Great point. Great question. So, first off, and I think Tom alluded to that, there's a lot more data than we think. The issue is actually not finding data. It's finding the relevant data. And there's increasingly reliable and objective data that can be found that explain what are the odds for a given company in a given geography or a given industry. What are the odds of being victim of a ransomware? Those can be found in the industries. So there's data. There's another side to another answer to your question. There are techniques to calibrate estimation of experts. When there's no data, there are ways, scientific ways, that have been deployed and used in many other industries than and not IT nor cyber. So they've been put to use for decades, and they're calibration estimates that help estimate minimum and maximum value of ranges. As Tom said, we're using ranges. And then Monte Carlo allows to make use of scarce and uncertain data. Again, not to come up with discrete values as to what amount of risk you have, but ranges of what losses you could incur in a given scenario.
Maybe just to expand and just to make sure we fully understand your question. So the model does both loss event frequency, which is probability of occurrence, and impact. So we do model probability of occurrence. Maybe it wasn't clear because I focused on the loss chain, but the model absolutely deals with the probability of an occurrence, and it breaks down. We can actually model a MITRE attack chain within the left-hand side of the model using these variables. So we can think about the probability of an attack, the probability of an attack getting initial foothold in a network based on a control stance, the probability of that attacker laterally moving across and impacting an asset. So we absolutely do model probability in that, if that was what your question was.